It was the day I laid my husband, Tom, to rest. I remember the chapel so clearly, the organ humming low, the polished wood pews, the scent of lilies in the air. I sat in the front row, hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to breathe through the weight of grief. I had chosen my black dress with care. It was simple, modest, and dignified. To anyone else, it might have seemed ordinary, but to me, it carried meaning. I wanted that day to be about honoring Tom, not about appearances. He had always told me, kindness is not weakness. That phrase had guided so much of my life, and it echoed in me even as I sat there, staring at his casket. But even in the quiet of mourning, cruelty has a way of finding its moment. I felt it when my daughter-in-law, Brooke, let her disdain slip into the air for everyone to hear. I didn't need to repeat her words to remember the sting. It wasn't just about the dress, it was about being diminished, about someone taking my most vulnerable moment and turning it into a stage for mockery. I could feel eyes shifting toward me, whispers rippling across the room. My son Ryan fidgeted, unable to defend me, and my daughter Lauren looked ready to rise in my defense. But I stayed still. I lowered my eyes, let the comments pass, and gave nothing back. It might have seemed like weakness, but that silence, that deliberate restraint wasn't surrender. It was choice. And even in that moment of humiliation, I knew there would come a time when the truth would surface. That time was not at the funeral, but it was coming. As the service continued, Brooke's comments lingered in the air, heavy and cutting. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the way she carried herself. Chin lifted, voice pitched, so others couldn't help but overhear. It was as if she wanted to place me on trial, right there in front of everyone gathered to honor Tom. I could sense the ripple it caused, the shift in posture, the glances exchanged, the uneasy whispers running through the pews like a current. Some people looked away out of discomfort, others leaned in, hungry for drama even in grief. And in the middle of it all, I sat motionless. Ryan, my son, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, torn between loyalty to his wife and his respect for me. Lauren's eyes burned with anger, her hand brushing against mine as if to say, "Don't let her do this to you." Inside, I could feel the pressure mounting, the sting of humiliation pressing harder with each passing second. But I chose silence. That silence wasn't weakness, it was a shield. I lowered my gaze, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew the weight of my truth would speak louder when the moment was right. Brooke thought she was exposing me. What she never realized was that every smug word only revealed her own lack of grace. The irony was almost bitterly funny to me. Here she was, trying to lecture me about quality, when the very buttons on my dress cost more than what she imagined the entire outfit was worth. The shoes on my feet alone had been made for $12,000, crafted with care most people would never recognize at a glance. But none of that mattered to me. What mattered was respect, and respect was the one thing she had chosen to trample on. I let the sting of her words sink in quietly, not for my own sake, but to remind myself of something Tom always believed, that true strength shows in restraint. That day, my silence became the first stone in a foundation I was building. A foundation for what would come next. Because I knew this moment wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. That evening, around 7:30 p.m., I walked back into my quiet apartment. From the outside, it looked so ordinary, an older building. Nothing that would catch anyone's eye. My car out front was the same modest Toyota I'd driven for years. Most people assumed that was all I owned, and I never corrected them. Let them think what they wanted. Appearances had never mattered much to me. I slipped off my shoes, the same ones Brooke had mocked earlier. To her, they looked like cheap knockoffs, but in truth, they had been made by hand for $12,000. I placed them carefully back in their box, almost like a ritual. Then I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the silence, letting Tom's voice echo in my memory. He used to remind me that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. That night, I finally understood what he meant. I walked over to an old oak bookshelf that had been in my family for decades. To anyone else, it looked like nothing more than a piece of furniture crowded with dusty novels and family photos. But I knew the truth. Behind those rows of books was a hidden latch. When I pressed it, the shelf swung open, revealing the room almost no one in my family even knew existed. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar and leather. On the walls hung photographs from years ago, the first boutique Tom and I had opened, the ribbon cutting, the smiles we wore when all we had was a rented stall and big dreams. Filing cabinets lined the walls, packed with contracts, property deeds, and business records. And on the desk lay sketches of new designs, swatches of fabric, and financial statements that represented decades of hard work. This was the secret I had kept even from my own children. I wasn't just a grieving widow in a plain black dress. I was the founder of Carter Atelier, a company that had grown into 17 luxury boutiques and 3 textile factories. The dress Brooke mocked that day wasn't a bargain bin find. It was a custom design from my own line, valued at $8,000. I sat at the desk, ran my hand across one of the old contracts, and felt both pride and anger welling up inside me. Brooke had no idea who she had chosen to humiliate. She thought she had embarrassed me beyond repair, but what she had really done was sign her own lesson. And I knew then it was only a matter of time before she learned it. The very next morning, I knew I couldn't let Brooke's behavior slide as nothing more than rudeness at a funeral. It wasn't only about me, it was about the way she treated people in general. Respect had always been the foundation Tom and I built our business on, and I couldn't ignore how far she had strayed from that principle. I picked up the phone that only a handful of people had the number to. On the other end was Maya Patel, my assistant, the person I trusted most in the company. She spoke with sympathy about Tom's passing, but I told her there was another matter we needed to handle quietly. I asked her to review Brooke Sinclair's employment file, every note, every complaint, every detail. By noon, Maya had called me back with results that didn't surprise me, but still left me disappointed. There were 3 official warnings for showing up late, 2 separate customer complaints about her arrogance, and notes from her supervisor describing how she acted as if she were above clients. It hurt to hear, but I wasn't shocked. Brooke had made a habit of mistaking condescension for confidence. The financial picture painted an even clearer story. She and Ryan were living in an apartment that stretched well beyond their means. Their credit card debt had already climbed past $4,000. A car loan added another $22,000 on top of that. And most recklessly of all, they had just filed paperwork to purchase a $4,000 home, counting on Brooke's supposed promotion as proof of future income. It wasn't poverty that drove her to belittle others. It was pretense. She was building a hollow life on borrowed money, desperate to keep up appearances while scorning anyone who didn't play the same game. Tom had always called it hollow living, and he was right. I didn't draft paperwork right then. Timing mattered. I needed her to reveal herself in the most undeniable way possible, and I knew exactly where to find that moment inside the flagship store itself. That Friday morning, I decided it was time to see things with my own eyes. I dressed in a gray cardigan, plain flats, and carried a handbag so understated it could have passed for something bought at a discount store. I wanted to walk into the flagship boutique not as the owner, but as any ordinary customer. The store gleamed under soft lighting, polished and serene. Associates moved gracefully, welcoming clients with genuine warmth, but Brooke stood out immediately. She leaned against the counter, phone pressed to her ear, laughing far too loudly. A woman with silver hair waited nearby, patient, but ignored. Brooke's attention was on her call, bragging about the promotion she believed was just around the corner. She even said things I could hardly stomach, how some customers didn't belong in a place like that. My chest tightened hearing it. Not for myself, but for that older woman who simply wanted to be treated with kindness. I stayed quiet, watching as Brooke finally rolled her eyes, ended her call, and sauntered toward me with a practiced smile. Her tone carried the same arrogance she had shown at the funeral. She tried to steer me toward clearance racks, as if I wasn't worthy of the better displays. And then, it happened. The doors opened, and Maya walked in. She carried herself with quiet authority as she approached me. I'll never forget the way she addressed me clearly and firmly. She said the managers were waiting for me upstairs. The air in that boutique shifted instantly. Employees glanced at one another, realizing who I truly was. Brooke's face went pale, confusion spilling into fear. I straightened my shoulders and allowed the silence to speak for itself. In that moment, the balance of power changed completely. The woman who had humiliated me at Tom's funeral now stood exposed, not by my anger, but by the truth of who I was. But this was only the beginning. There was more Brooke needed to hear, and more lessons still to come. Later that week, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I asked Ryan to come by my apartment. His face was drawn, heavy with questions he hadn't dared to ask yet. I led him to the living room and pressed the latch on the bookshelf. When the panel swung open, I watched his expression change. He stepped inside that hidden study for the first time, and I could see the disbelief wash over him. The walls were lined with framed photographs, our first boutique opening. Tom and I holding the ribbon together, smiles wide despite the exhaustion of long nights. There were contracts, financial records, sketches of dresses that had once only lived in my imagination. It was the life Tom and I had built from nothing, brick by brick, decision by decision. Ryan asked, with his eyes what words couldn't form. I could see him realizing that the modest apartment and the old Toyota had never told the full story. I explained gently that Tom and I had made a choice years ago to live simply, to keep our family grounded, and to raise our children on values that couldn't be bought. Respect, hard work, humility. Those were the true heirlooms we wanted to pass down. I handed him a folder with reports about Brooke, her behavior with clients, the complaints, the debts she had kept hidden. I didn't tell him what to do. I only told him he deserved the truth. And now he had to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. It was painful to see him caught between loyalty and clarity. But I knew that protecting him from the truth would only chain him to someone who had never respected him or me. That moment was not just about exposing Brooke. It was about preparing Ryan for what lay ahead. And I sensed the hardest choices were still to come. A few mornings later, at about 10:15 a.m., Brooke showed up at my office. She didn't look like the polished woman who had stood in the chapel or bragged at the boutique. Her hair was unkempt, her makeup smudged, her clothes wrinkled as if she had slept in them. She clutched her bag tightly, her whole body trembling with desperation. She asked me for another chance, her words tumbling out fast, layered with panic. But as I listened, I realized what she was really saying. She wasn't grieving over the harm she had caused. She wasn't even acknowledging the way she had humiliated me at Tom's funeral or dismissed that older woman in the store. Her tears weren't for the pain she had inflicted, they were for the consequences she now faced. I sat with her words for a long moment before answering. Inside, I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only disappointment. I told myself I would not confuse punishment with growth. If Brooke was ever going to change, it had to start with honesty, not excuses. So instead of granting her job back or offering the forgiveness she wanted, I gave her one final test. I told her the only way forward was to sit down with Ryan and tell him the truth. Not the polished version, not the softened edges. She needed to confess everything: the debts, the arrogance at work, and the cruelty she had shown to me when I was at my most vulnerable. I knew the request would shake her, but I also knew it was the only chance she had to step into real accountability. And if she couldn't face the man she had built a life with, then she wasn't ready to face change. As I watched her leave my office, shoulders slumped, I wondered whether she had the courage to follow through. Either way, the choice was no longer mine to make. 2 nights later, around 9:40 p.m., the phone rang. It was Ryan. His voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. The sound of a man who had just faced the truth without a safety net. He told me Brooke had finally sat down with him and laid it all out: the debts, the lies at work, the way she had treated me at Tom's funeral. She cried, she apologized, but when he asked her why she had done it, she had no real answer. I could hear the breaking in his voice as he said he couldn't keep carrying a marriage built on pretense and disrespect. He told me he had asked for a divorce. There was no triumph in his tone, only devastation mixed with an odd sense of relief. He admitted that for the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe without carrying someone else's burden. As his mother, my heart ached. No parent wants to hear their child speak through tears of betrayal and loss. But beneath the pain, I also felt pride. Ryan was finally stepping out of the shadow of Brooke's arrogance and into his own truth. And then he surprised me. He said he wanted to start again from the ground up. He wanted to work in the very stores I had built, not as an heir, not as a man with privilege, but as a sales associate. He wanted to learn, to earn back what had been lost, and most importantly, to rebuild my respect. In that moment, I realized Tom's lessons hadn't been lost. They had simply been waiting for the right time to surface. Ryan was ready to start a new chapter, even if it meant beginning at the very bottom. And I knew what I had to do next: set the conditions that would define not only his path, but Lauren's as well. That weekend, at 11 o'clock in the morning, I gathered both Ryan and Lauren in my living room. On the coffee table sat 2 envelopes I had prepared long ago, each holding the truth about what Tom and I had built and what would one day be theirs. I looked at my children, both weary from different battles, Ryan carrying the scars of a broken marriage, and Lauren balancing her own life of service as a teacher. I reminded them of the principles their father and I had lived by: respect, humility, responsibility. Those were the cornerstones of our lives, and they would be the foundation of any inheritance. I handed the first envelope to Ryan. Inside was the outline of his future control of the boutiques and factories, but only if he worked his way up from the ground. 5 full years, starting as a floor associate, learning every role, serving every type of customer. Only then would he earn the right to lead. Then I turned to Lauren and gave her the second envelope. She would inherit the properties and investments, but with a condition as well. A portion of those funds had to be dedicated to education programs for children who needed it most. Our wealth had to serve a greater purpose than comfort. Finally, I laid down the most important rule of all. If either of them ever used wealth to belittle others, if they ever confused privilege with superiority, they would lose everything. Respect had to remain the thread tying our family together. They both nodded, not in excitement, but in solemn understanding. In that moment, I felt Tom's presence so strongly, as if he were standing beside me, proud that the values we had lived by would continue beyond us. And yet, there was still one last echo of this story waiting to find its place. 6 months later, I walked into the same flagship boutique where so much had unraveled. The store still carried its quiet elegance, polished floors, and warm lighting. But this time, my eyes went straight to the counter. There stood Ryan, not in a suit, not in a position of authority, but in the simple uniform of a sales associate. His posture was straighter, his smile gentler, and when he looked up and saw me, I felt a wave of pride wash over me. He told me about a customer who had come in the day before a widow, nervous and unsure, clearly feeling like she didn't belong in a luxury store. Ryan admitted that his first instinct had been to steer her toward clearance racks, the same mistake Brooke had made countless times. But instead, he remembered what I had taught him. He treated her like she mattered. She walked out with nothing more than a $50 scarf, but she left the store smiling as if she carried the whole world in that small box. That was the kind of wealth no bank account could measure. Not long after, late one evening, my phone rang. On the other end was Brooke. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. She told me she finally understood. Losing her job, losing Ryan, it had stripped away the illusions she had clung to. She had learned, painfully, that respect isn't about money or status. It's about how you treat people when they have nothing to offer you in return. I didn't offer her forgiveness, but I offered her a simple truth. Real elegance begins with respect. And as I hung up the phone, I looked out at the fading sunset and heard Tom's words echo once again in my heart. Kindness is not weakness. This story has been my reminder that appearances deceive, but respect endures. If you've ever had kindness mistaken for weakness, I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments, and let's keep spreading the kind of strength that truly lasts. And if this touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe so more people can be reminded that respect is priceless.